The letter came stitched between folds of silence and dust. The ink smeared but legible, carried westward by a wagon driver who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite last season. It was addressed to Elijah Coyle, whose name had not been spoken aloud in his cabin for months, not since the last snow broke through the roof and took half the food with it. He read it by the dull light of morning, the sky pale as milk beyond the frost-rimmed window. "Sir," it began with stiff, unfeeling formality, "your request has been accepted. A suitable bride has been found. She will arrive by the 3rd week of April, pending safe travel." There was more details of payment and arrangements, but Elijah stopped reading there. He folded the letter with a slowness that bordered on reverence and set it beside the iron stove where embers still whispered from the night before. He had not meant for it to come to this. He'd held off longer than most men would, bearing the solitude like a stone in his chest, like a penance. But the winters grew harder each year, and the silence began to take on shapes he couldn't ignore. Ghosts of what could have been, or once had been, wandering his mind like coyotes through snow. So he'd written the agency, sent what coin he had left after the land tax, and asked for someone plain and willing, someone with strong hands and no taste for vanity. He hadn't asked for kindness. He didn't believe in the luxury of it. When she stepped off the stage in Red Hollow, Elijah saw she carried no parasol or satin, just a canvas satchel and a face like weathered parchment, as though she'd known wind before she knew peace. She stood with her spine straight, shoulders squared beneath a faded shawl, and her eyes swept the town with a quiet sort of calculation. He moved toward her stiffly, as if relearning the act of approaching another soul. "Miss Wren?" he asked. The woman nodded, her dark hair pinned back in a way that revealed a thin scar curling near her left temple. "Elijah Coyle." She looked him over once, not with the flinch or fear he'd come to expect from folks unused to his rough height or cold-dusted coat, but with something else, an almost weary acceptance. "I don't reckon we'll be strangers long," she said simply. Her voice was low but not soft. She spoke like someone used to being heard or not needing to repeat herself. He respected that more than he let show. The ride to his cabin took half a day by wagon, the road a crooked wound across scrub and prairie. Elijah watched her from the corner of his eye. She did not ask questions, did not remark on the land or the weather. She sat still, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere just ahead, as if already studying the horizon of her new life. At the cabin, she unpacked with a silence that made him ache. Not for conversation exactly, but for something more elusive, the way a person's presence could warm a room without words. He wasn't sure yet if she possessed that gift, or if he was simply imagining her into a shape he could endure. The first days passed like smoke through a cracked door. She cleaned, tended the goats, chopped wood with the precision of someone who had once split logs, not for survival, but to prove she could. Elijah watched her sometimes when she wasn't looking, not out of desire, but curiosity. She moved with care, but not caution. Her body bore its history and posture, not fragility. He noticed the way she kept to the edge of the porch in the evenings, facing the dying sun like it owed her something. She would stand there with her arms crossed, head tilted slightly, and he wondered if she was counting regrets or simply giving them room to breathe. They spoke little at first. His voice felt too loud in her presence, and hers too valuable to squander on idle things. But once after supper, he found her mending one of his old shirts and remarked quietly, "You're good with a needle." She didn't look up. Had a sister who'd sew stories into her quilts. Thought if she stitched the sorrow in just right, it couldn't get loose in the night. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she didn't seem to mind. As April gave way to a late thaw, something in the house began to soften. Not between them exactly, but in the air, in the spaces where silence no longer felt like a wound. Elijah found himself leaving an extra cup on the table without thinking, fetching a second pail of water from the stream out of habit. And once waking from a dream he didn't remember, He heard her crying in the other room. Not loud, just the kind of quiet weeping a person does when they don't want comfort, only witness. He did not go to her, but he sat up, lit the stove, and stoked it so the cold wouldn't find her when she finished. In the morning, she said nothing of it, and neither did he. But when he left for the valley that afternoon, her scarf was folded in his coat pocket. By May, the earth had remembered how to breathe again. Shoots of green broke through the frostbitten crust, tentative and thin, like hope tested once too often. The goats bleated more often now, restless in their pens, and birdsong returned in cautious bursts, as if uncertain they'd be welcomed. Elijah repaired the fence while Wren planted root vegetables in neat, stubborn rows behind the cabin. She worked with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing forearms marred with pale, thin scars that said nothing and everything. He never asked about them. Some things a man earns the right to know, and some are given like offerings on a silent altar. He figured she'd speak when she was ready, or not at all. Still, she began to hum when she worked. Soft tunes without words drifting on the wind like pollen. They weren't cheerful melodies exactly, but they carried something else. Resilience, maybe, a way of saying, I'm still here. One morning, she left the cabin before dawn. Elijah rose to find her side of the bed cold and neatly made. Panic bloomed in his chest before he stamped it down. She left her boots by the door, which meant she hadn't run. He found her near the creek, barefoot in the shallows, her hem damp, face turned to the sky. The light had barely crept over the ridge, but her eyes were open wide, like she needed the morning to see her back. Didn't mean to worry you, she said when she noticed him. He said nothing at first, just watched the water curl around her ankles. Couldn't sleep. She shook her head. Sometimes I need to remember the sound of water moving. Not frozen, not still, just going. Elijah nodded slowly. I get that. He didn't tell her how. Some nights he used to lay awake counting the cracks in the ceiling, trying to recall the cadence of laughter, the weight of a warm body in bed beside him. That was a past he hadn't spoken of in years, not even to himself. A wife buried under spring mud, a baby never born. Instead, he stepped closer and handed her her boots. She took them without thanks, but their fingers brushed, and she didn't pull away. By midsummer, the rhythm of their days had deepened. Wren took to keeping the ledger, tracking what supplies they'd need come fall. Her script was elegant and lean, the kind a school teacher might have had once before war or widowhood. Elijah noticed her gaze lingering longer at night, sometimes catching him in the low light and not looking away. There was no flirtation in it, no coyness, just witness. She saw him. The way he walked with a slight limp from a broken leg, never set right. How he paused before speaking, like measuring the weight of his words before letting them go. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning. The wind came down from the north, angry and sudden, slapping the shutters and howling through the cracks. Elijah moved fast, pulling in the goats, double latching the doors. Inside, Wren lit every lamp, her face steady but her hands tight on the flint. When thunder cracked over the hills, she flinched visibly, stepping back like she'd been struck. He crossed to her, then not touching, just standing close. It'll pass, he said. I know, she murmured, but knowing don't always help. And for the first time he asked something he hadn't dared before. Was it storms where you came from? She looked up at him, eyes glinting like wet stone. Worse than storms, but storms bring it back. That night, as the rain hammered the roof and the world shrank to firelight and breath, she lay down, not in the spare room, but beside him. No words, no promises, just the press of her back to his chest, his hand resting lightly over her ribs, the rise and fall of her breathing like a rhythm older than fear. He did not sleep, but for once, he did not mind. In the morning, she made cornbread and eggs, and he fetched water, and neither of them said a word about the night. But when he passed her in the doorway, she reached out and touched his arm. That was all, but it was enough. August bore down with the weight of sun and silence. The grass yellowed at the edges, and flies gathered thick around the horse's flanks. Days stretched long and unbending, the air sticky with heat that clung to the skin and made tempers slow to rise, slower to settle. Wren took to walking in the evenings, boots dusty, a rag tied around her neck to catch the sweat. Elijah watched her from the porch sometimes, pipe cold in his hand. She moved through the fields like someone chasing something just out of reach, though she never said what it was. Their lives had become something like habit, but not without friction. Once she left the milk out too long, and it spoiled, and he barked at her, sharp and thoughtless. "You think I don't know how to keep food?" she snapped, eyes flaring in a way he hadn't seen before. He regretted it the second the words left him, but instead of retreating, she stood her ground. "I ain't a gaze," and in it saw not defiance but gaze, and in it saw not defiance but sorrow. She wasn't angry about the milk. She was angry about the world that made her explain her worth. "I know that," he said, and meant it. "Wasn't fair of me." She nodded once, clipped, and walked out to the orchard. That night she came to bed later than usual, but she came. As summer began to roll itself into the burnt edges of September, the past began to surface in unexpected ways. They were stacking wood one morning when a man rode up the ridge. Tall, lean, with a cavalry coat slung over one shoulder and a rifle too clean to be a settler's. Elijah stepped between him and the house out of instinct. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man grinned without warmth, looking for a woman named Wren Rourke. "Heard she was out this way." Wren stepped from behind the shed, apron streaked with sap and dirt. Her face went still. "Hello, James." Elijah looked between them, the name foreign on her tongue. The man's smile deepened. "Well, I'll be damned. You're still breathing." Wren didn't respond. She wiped her hands on her apron, slow and deliberate. "Why are you here?" James shrugged. "Figured you owed me a goodbye or a bullet. Either way, I came ready." Elijah's fingers flexed near his belt, but didn't reach for the knife. Wren's voice, when it came, was brittle. "You took enough already. There ain't anything left that belongs to you." James laughed and turned his horse without another word. When the dust settled, Wren leaned against the porch rail, her face pale. Later, as twilight dulled the ridge to charcoal, she sat beside Elijah on the porch, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug. "He was my husband," she said quietly. "First one thought the war broke him, but truth is, he was cruel long before it started." Elijah didn't speak, just let her say it without interruption. "He hit me often, told me no one would take me after him. I ran the night he put his hands around my throat and didn't stop until I hit Missouri." She didn't cry. He didn't reach for her. They just sat in the growing dark, the air thick with old ghosts. "I never thought I'd speak his name again," she murmured. Elijah looked at her, then really looked. "I reckon names don't hold power unless you let 'em." She met his gaze, something fragile and fierce in her eyes. "You believe that?" "I do now." That night she took his hand in hers, not out of need but choice. Her fingers were calloused, her palms rough, but her grip was steady. He understood then that grace wasn't softness. It was strength-worn, quiet. It was a woman who carried her pain like firewood, heavy but useful, something that could warm or burn depending on how it was tended. And for the first time, he felt something uncoil in his chest that wasn't regret or longing, but peace. She'd been right. They wouldn't be strangers long. Autumn slipped in like a whispered apology, softening the edges of the land with gold and rust. The wind grew cooler, curling through the trees like it knew the names of the dead. Elijah found himself rising earlier, drawn by the quiet promise of dawn. The fire took longer to catch now, and the animals moved slower in the chill. Wren had taken to pressing herbs, drying bundles of eero and mint beneath the eaves. The scent of them clung to her hair, so that when she moved past him, it left a trail like memory. She spoke more often these days, small things, practical things, but the warmth beneath her voice came easier now, like water after drought. They were standing together by the shed, mending a wagon wheel, when a letter arrived, brought by a boy from town who wouldn't meet Elijah's eye, likely half scared of the man's reputation for solitude and silence. Wren opened the envelope while Elijah watched the horizon. "It's from the agency," she said after a long moment. He didn't turn. "What's it say?" She hesitated. "They're asking if I need to be relocated in case things didn't work out here." That made him turn. His eyes found hers, quiet but sharp. "And what do you want me to say to that?" he asked. "I don't need you to say anything." Her voice was steady. "I just wanted you to know I chose not to answer." He nodded, something easing in his chest. "Good." Wren folded the letter and set it in the stove without ceremony. The flames licked it up without hesitation. That night they sat close by the fire, knees brushing. Elijah told her about his wife, about the miscarriage that ended a future he once believed in. Wren listened without pity, her hands still as stone in her lap. "I stopped talking to God after that," he said, not quite sure why. Didn't stop believing, just didn't see the point in conversation. She reached over, then took his hand, her fingers laced with his like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I think he listens even when we don't speak," she said. "Same way I've listened to you since I got here." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of sorrow, not quite healed, but tended like a wound bound in clean cloth. Days passed. The orchard gave up its last fruit, and Wren canned them with a diligence that bordered on reverent. Elijah carved her a new spoon from red cedar, left it on the table without note. She didn't mention it, but he saw her using it the next morning. They went to town together in late October, the first time they'd appeared in public, side by side. Folks looked but didn't speak. Wren held her chin high, her dress plain but mended, her hands free of gloves. Elijah walked a step behind, not out of submission but respect, like he was following something sacred. At the general store, an older woman, widow from the look of her, smiled at Wren and offered her a spool of thread from the bargain bin. "Nice to see a man like him find company again," she said under her breath. Wren smiled politely but didn't answer. Outside, she looked up at Elijah. "You ever think we're still strangers in their eyes?" He shrugged. "Let 'em look. They ain't the ones who warm the stove or split the wood." That night, Wren laid her head on his chest, the sound of his heartbeat steady in her ear. He wrapped his arms around her without thought, without fear, and somewhere between sleep and wakefulness, she whispered, "I never thought I'd be safe again." He didn't answer right away, just pressed his lips to her hair and held her a little tighter. "You are now." And for the first time in either of their lives, the truth didn't feel like a fragile thing. Snow came early that year, quiet and absolute. It blanketed the ridge in silence, smoothing the scars of the earth beneath a veil of white. Wren stood at the window that morning, her breath fogging the glass as she watched flakes settle like ash on the porch rail. Elijah stirred the fire behind her, the kettle already hissing low. They had lived a full year together now. Not a year marked by grand milestones or declarations, but by small, hard-won things. A fence repaired, a fever endured, a moment in the woods where she reached for his hand without needing to. Wren turned from the window and crossed the room, slipping her arms around Elijah's waist. He let the spoon fall from his hand and leaned into her, chin resting atop her head. "We made it through," she said softly. He did not ask what she meant, whether the season or the past, the storms or the man who had once ridden up their road like a ghost demanding tribute. Some reckonings don't need naming. Later that morning, they brought the goats fresh straw and chopped enough wood to see them through the next storm. Wren laughed when Elijah slipped on the ice and cursed, the sound of it light and sudden, cracking the cold air like a bell. He grinned more at the sound than the fall brushing snow from his coat. She helped him up, tugging his glove like they were dancing. By dusk, the sky turned the color of bruised lilac, and they sat by the fire with their boots drying nearby, supper steaming between them. Wren passed him a bowl, her hand brushing his in a way that was no longer incidental. "Do you still think of her?" she asked. Not accusing, just curious. Elijah stirred his stew. "Some nights less now." Wren nodded. "I think of the girl I was before James, before Missouri. She feels like someone I once read about, not someone I ever was." He looked at her then, the lines near his eyes deepening. "You ain't that girl no more." "No, but sometimes I wish I could tell her what was common, that she'd survive it, that she'd find someone who wouldn't break her down to feel big." Elijah reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. "She'd be proud of the woman you became." There was quiet between them, the fire snapping low. Wren squeezed his hand once, then let go to stand and fetch a small wrapped parcel from the mantel. "I made you something," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a scarf knit from thick wool, uneven in places but warm and real. He touched it like it might dissolve. "You made this?" She nodded. "Didn't know how. Learned." He stood and wrapped it around his neck. The roughness of, "It's a small thing," he said softly, almost shy, "but I've got something too." He reached into the drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved and worn smooth at the edges. A sparrow had been etched into the lid, simple but careful work. Without ceremony, he placed it in her hands. Wren opened it slowly. Her breath caught. Inside were seeds, tiny envelopes neatly labeled in ink. Sage, lavender, wild rose, goldenrod. "I thought when spring comes," he said, "you might want more color around here." She blinked once, then again. No tears fell, but her voice trembled slightly. "No one's ever planted something just for me." He stepped closer and rested his hands gently on her shoulders. "You didn't come here to be rescued, Wren. You came here to live. I'm just lucky I get to live beside you." She lifted her gaze to his, and in her eyes he saw the full shape of their story. Not the bargain that had first brought them together, not the bruises, the quiet stretches, or the long, aching nights, but the grace she had shown him, the quiet strength of showing up, of loving without conditions, of choosing to stay. They remained like that until the fire dimmed to embers and the wind rose outside the walls. And then, without another word, they stepped forward into the rest of their lives, side by side, as snow drifted down beyond the window, soft and silent as a prayer.